Hello, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel today, but at the same time, I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be there in Belgrade. Unfortunately, pandemic travel conditions are not easy, so I will be joining you for the questions and answers, and this video is pre-recorded just in case of any technical issues. So I look forward to discussing and hearing your thoughts at the end of my presentation. I will be talking about a collection of materials, which I have provisionally titled the Yugoslav Non-Aligned Movement Solidarity Archive. And I will be talking about methodological issues as well as the contents of the archive. The archive I'm talking about can very broadly be categorized as an archive of Yugoslav political relations with African countries during the period of their decolonization. This is an archive of the political work of Olja Dzuverovic, who worked for the Commission for Assistance to the Liberation Movement at the Socialist Alliance of the Working People of Yugoslavia. She was subsequently a Yugoslav diplomat, and throughout her life, she was a key agent in Yugoslav support and solidarity with countries in the process of decolonization. Her work was focused mostly on the assistance to the liberation movements in Africa, and most specifically, her biggest focus was Namibia. Olja was my aunt. She was my mother's sister, and she took a very active role in my upbringing, to the extent that in the family she was thought of as my second mother. The materials that I'm presenting here have come to be in my possession after Olja's untimely death in 2006, and I'm now in the process of identifying the most suitable long-term context for the afterlife of this archive, cataloging the materials, and through a series of working sessions together with colleagues here at the Museum of African Art in Belgrade and others, colleagues at my university, trying to open up entry points and ways of engaging and activating this archive. As this archive takes the journey slowly from being a private archive to a public collection. In this talk, I will focus on presenting the material in the archive, starting with a very quick biographical introduction to Olja Dzuverovic, even though, of course, the personal story and the archive materials are deeply interconnected and cannot be separated. Because time is limited, I have chosen to focus on the archive content and prioritize explaining and showing you what's actually to be found in this archive. I will focus on giving an overview of what's in the archive, and will conclude with some thoughts on the methodological challenges in doing this type of work and some closing remarks about ways forward. Born in 1947 in Belgrade, Olja Dzuverovic was an archaeologist by education, university education, but was also very politically active from an early age. And it was this activism and political engagement that quickly took over, overtaking her interest in archaeology and also art, which remained important to her throughout her life. Through her engagement with the youth movement, Union of Yugoslav Youth, and her activism and solidarity with African comrades who were coming to Yugoslavia at the time, as part of various liberation movements, she became personally interested and invested in the liberation struggles of these countries. And she became the head of international relations at the Union of Yugoslav Youth, and later, from mid-70s, worked at the Commission for Assistance to the Liberation Movements at the Socialist Alliance of the Working People of Yugoslavia in various roles. From the late 80s, she worked at the Yugoslav Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and her work, her diplomatic career took her abroad, as she was posted in Zimbabwe in the 80s, and then later on in the 90s, she was posted, she worked at the Yugoslav Embassy in South Africa. The shift in values of Yugoslavia at the time, in the 90s, led her to resign from the embassy in Pretoria, and cutting ties with her diplomatic life, she moved from South Africa to the neighboring Namibia, where she stayed until the end of her life. As a result of her early active engagement during Namibia's struggle for liberation, and the links she had established with Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, and then President of Namibia, Sam Nujoma. She was granted a Namibian passport and offered the role of special advisor to the Minister of Gender Equality and Child Welfare, a position that she occupied from the year 2000 until her untimely death at the age of 58 in 2006. But I would claim that more important than the formal CV that I have just given you and the listing of the different roles that she occupied was Olja's lifetime commitment to the principles of socialism and equality and the decolonial project, which were woven into everything that she did. Here we have an example of how she signed her work with the simple title Political Worker, which points to the belief in working collectively and to the way that she lived solidarity. I will now speak about the contents of the archive a little bit. And as I speak, I would like us to think in relation to the non-aligned movement and in relation to Yugoslavia about how we historicize and remember, what material, events, images, and acts reach the public realm and contribute to knowledge production, becoming canonical representations of historical events, and what meanings we attach to them. I say this with a view to perhaps, through looking at this archive, proposing the opening up of multiple channels beyond the formal images, beyond the well-known images, and the state-sponsored events around the non-aligned movement, to perhaps include smaller, less visible acts, relations, and forms of solidarity. In other words, what I'm advocating for is to add texture and think about relationships in a more critical and analytical way. I would like us to consider the act of reading the archive, thinking with Gayatri Spivak, when she writes about, and I quote, pattern of exclusions that makes the familiar function as such. Spivak asks, as the historical record is made up, who is dropped out, when, and why? In other words, I would like us to think of the political unconscious, to draw on Frederick Jameson's term, that underpins the material in any archive, both through the very existence of those particular materials and what we do with them, what importance and role we subsequently give them, and what we choose to focus on. In the case of this archive, I cannot help but think of it in terms of gender. In the history of progressive and emancipatory political moment, which has nevertheless been inscribed within a deeply patriarchal logic. For example, the discrepancies between the frequent mentions of the role of women as active agents in liberation struggles and the blatantly male-dominated public face of the non-aligned movement, I see a gap that we can work through. Here, for instance, we see an image of Olja as the only woman amongst probably hundreds at a large political gathering. And you will have noticed in the images I already showed that that is a pattern in most images that come up. Of course, this is an extreme example. So what is actually in this archive? The archive consists of probably several thousand items, individual items, dating mostly from the late 70s and the early 80s. And the materials are predominantly in English, French, Portuguese, and Serbo-Croat, with a couple of documents in Arabic. It consists of internal Socialist Alliance of Working People of Yugoslavia documents, United Nations reports, briefing documents, newsletters, magazines, and bulletins of various organizations such as SWAPO, Namibia Youth, the Combatant, Azania Contact, the Zimbabwe Review, some also in Serbo-Croat, like Marxism u Svetu, Africa Confidential, etc. There are many books about Africa, about the non-aligned movement, about individual leaders, histories of liberation struggles, etc. There are newspaper clippings, conference documentation, agendas, papers, leaflets, speeches. There are Olja's handwritten or hand-corrected documents or drafts, summaries of papers given at conferences that she often translated and summarized in Serbo-Croat, her own summaries, of newly published books of significance to the non-aligned movement and to the work of her department. There are photographs, as you can see, letters, cards. There are also clusters of up to 30 documents associated with particular events. So, for example, I'm showing you here a cluster of documents around the symposium Amilcar Cabral, held in Praia in Cabo Verde from the 17th to 20th of January in 1983. And this event is covered thoroughly and comprises approximately 20 documents. Not only does this cluster include copies of numerous speeches given at the symposium, but also it contains Olja's own handwritten summaries of some of the speeches in Serbo-Croat. So the speeches would have been delivered in Portuguese, French, or English, and she summarized them for the use of everyone at her workplace. And she draws out key points, draws on, basically provides a summary with pages of key points. It is material like this that I find to be of most significance because it adds another level of reading to this material. So what would have been deemed important, significant at that particular moment. This is another cluster from another conference. So there's some envelopes with very well organized materials that she would have put aside. There are also some interesting and original materials, unique documents, such as, for instance, this handwritten letter authored by members of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, a South African national liberation Pan-Africanist movement. And this was sent to the ambassador of Tanzania, Yugoslav ambassador, and he forwarded it to Olja's office. So we have this original document where they are writing about their current situation. Other materials I was very interested in the field of culture. For example, there's a correspondence with Filmske Novosti, the government production company which produced documentaries about Yugoslav activities at the time. So, for example, this is a synopsis for a proposal for a film to be produced by Filmske Novosti, which was sent to the department. It's entitled Yugoslavian Liberation Movements, Yugoslavia Slobodilački pokreti, from 1983. And in the correspondence, they're asking for any comments that the office might have on the synopsis before the film is given a go-ahead. So we have the full synopsis, which would have been sent to them for feedback. I don't know if this film was ever made. I want to now move on to some methodological issues to do with this, to working with this archive. So the process of organizing this archive and finding the right frequencies, so to speak, for its further life and further resonance is a slow process. And I want to just focus on some methodological challenges. As you can already see from some of the images I have shown, much of the material is not dated and the location is not specified. So there's some forensic work to be done there. Many of the written documents are unsigned, so it's difficult to be certain of their author and to what specific use they were intended. So, for example, are they briefings, are they meetings, are they internal meetings, what channels of communication are. In terms of research ethics, given that some of the information is labeled classified, there is also a question mark, but this should not be an issue as the material is in this archive is more than 25 years old and the default amount of time is 10 years. But aside from the legal issues, there are also questions about sharing information to do with people involved in this work and images, those who authored the text and those who appear in images. So obviously this is something to be investigated, and currently the archive is not available or accessible anywhere other than what you're seeing now. So in summary, the value of this collection lies in the combination of materials collected over decades, documenting methodical work as well as extensive travels of someone deeply immersed in the support of grassroots movements, but operating at state level, as well as the fact that some of this material may not exist elsewhere due to a fire that took place in the archives of Yugoslavia and Belgrade in the 90s. And we have been told that some of this material or material that could also be contained here may not exist elsewhere. A crucial significance for me also lies in the way that we can observe working processes in a government department whose mission was one of solidarity and support at a very specific political moment. It can be seen as a case study in diplomatic relations, knowledge production, and processes and communication that underpin such work. As has already become clear, this is a rich and multifaceted archive which requires substantial study and cataloging and analysis. As with any archive, it's incongruous. There are many stages of the archive coming into being, each colored by a succession of subjective decisions. So there are many voices involved in its creation and its readings. In this case, we of course must begin with the numerous authors of the material and their respective contexts. The primary voices that are to be found in the archive, the politicians, the scholars, the activists, the revolutionaries, the diplomats, whose work needs to be read in the broader historical context of the moment they're working in. A very important central agent is, of course, Olja herself and her readings of these texts, as well as her decision to preserve these materials, no doubt fueled by the understanding of their importance. I should add that parts of the archive were organized and labeled by her in envelopes, labeled with the event and the country, some of them, which demonstrates a clear intention to preserve them, while other parts of these materials were in her room in Belgrade and were collected by myself and my mother. There's, of course, the political context, the voice of Yugoslav non-alignment, and the very fact that a commission for assistance to the liberation movements at the Socialist Alliance of Working People of Yugoslavia did exist and had substantial agency and government support to aid the liberation struggles of these countries in concrete and practical ways. There is, of course, some 30 or 40 years later, the intervention by my mother, Vesna, and myself to preserve, pack, transport, and begin to catalog this material. And there's our own context and our position, as well as our personal agendas, which is, of course, to ensure that Olja's work remains available and accessible. There's the interest of the Museum of African Art in Belgrade as a partner to embark on this project, enabling this conversation. And as I'm working with it, I keep thinking about the different readings of this archive and how it can best be deployed, so to speak, or activated today, and in what context and for whom. Gayatri Spivak, to return to her writing, reminds us that the willed autobiography of the West masquerades as disinterested history, even when the critic presumes to touch its unconscious. I think that in order to attempt to undo the dominant naturalized readings of archives is to allow for their undoing and to allow for material to tell us other stories. Spivak's notion of worlding, a form of othering, which emerges from the language used and accounts of events that are perpetually being told by the voice of power, can be applied here to acknowledge that the history of the non-aligned movement and Yugoslavia's role in it, as much as it's an important history, it's also a patriarchal history. Whilst we are here working with material that ruptures imperialist narratives, we must allow that material to speak and put into question naturalized gendered roles. The narrative of non-alignment and the narrative of Yugoslavia, with their progressive and emancipatory impulses, are still narratives told and cemented by agents of patriarchy. As Olja herself said in one of her speeches in Namibia, if women of our country are not fully equal and empowered, none of us can be free and empowered. I'm just drawing here on some articles in the bulletins, and I'm interested in the gap between the engagement with questions of sex discrimination here and the question of women in the struggle, and the discrepancy between that and the images that we see at top political level. So predominantly male agents enabling what we see as these processes and solidarity and creating connections. So I'm kind of interested in where that gap is and kind of where that conversation can lead us. In thinking about the next steps with this archive, I see my role as one of a conduit or a temporary keeper, or perhaps the original Latin meaning of the term curator, which is to take care, so the caretaker, who will simply safeguard the materials. The next steps are top-level cataloging, which is what I've shown you in the database earlier, so a very simple cataloging and keywording. Working sessions with relevant researchers, which we could say this is one of them, but I will be organizing some more through my work and in collaboration with the Museum of African Art. Making contact with relevant archives and special collections to see, perhaps, to find a home for this archive, and eventually the donation of the archive to the most relevant body and an agreement about its future uses. In conclusion, what this archive is showing me so far is that top-down narratives of the non-aligned movement are, of course, important and must be remembered and nurtured, but that the actual meaning of solidarity can best be understood through multiple voices, perhaps voices from below, we could say, paying attention to the language used, paying attention to individual gestures and situations, finding those moments of solidarity, and above all, connecting with that genuine faith that I feel existed at this time in the possibilities and the ethos of solidarity amongst those who were trying to stand in the way of capitalist and colonial domination. On that note, I leave you with a quote by Olja herself from a letter to a friend written in 1993. And I quote, "And I also hope that on the ashes of both capitalist way of production and of domination, entirely new and more humane logic of life and relationships will emerge. But it is a long way, not in our lifetimes." And I think that even if these changes, these new relationships, did not happen in her lifetime and may not even happen in ours, the beauty and the possibilities of this archive and other archives like it is that it creates a connection with the visions of many who actively worked to bring us closer to what she calls a more humane logic of life and relationships. Thank you for listening.